You are now listening to a podcast made in collaboration with the Copenhagen College Radio.
Hey everybody, welcome to episode 70 of the Social Media and Politics podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Becerra, political scientist at the University of Copenhagen. Connect with us on Twitter at SMNP Podcast and sign up for the newsletter on our website, socialmediaandpolitics.org. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for tuning in. I have a fantastic episode lined up for you today with Dr. Homero Zúñiga. He is a professor at the Department of Communication at the University of Vienna and director of the Media and Innovation Lab there as well. And what we're going to be talking about is a theory that Dr. Zúñiga, together with his colleagues, has come up with called the news finds me perception. And what that is, in short, is the idea that in today's saturated media environment, because there's news coming at us from all different platforms and angles, particularly on social media, that citizens are starting to have the perception that they don't need to seek out news, but important news will simply find them. And it kind of makes sense, right? I mean, with people sharing news on social media or push notifications to your phone or newsletters coming in your inbox, there's a sort of disincentive to actually go and seek out the day's news when there's so much information already around us. And something that's interesting that we're going to get into in the episode is that even though we're surrounded by so much information and so much news, we might be having the perception that we're well informed, but the type of news that we're getting may not be the high quality journalism of the broadcast era. Now, if you're listening to this podcast, you're probably not too worried about this perception because you're well informed by virtue of listening to this podcast, but it might warrant some concern for younger generations who, according to some studies, are spending up to 9 hours a day on their smartphones. So in this episode, we're going to dig into the news finds me perception and its effects. And what's interesting is it's not correlated directly with voting behavior. So in other words, having this perception that the news will find you doesn't seem to have an effect on whether you'll vote or not, but it is negatively correlated with political interest and political knowledge. And what that means is that if you have the news finds me perception, you're probably less interested in politics, less seeking news about politics, and therefore you are less likely to vote. So it's quite hardcore. We're going to get into a lot of statistics and variables and communication and political science jargon. Have your finger on the rewind button. You might need it, but there's a lot of knowledge in this episode, so stick with it. And what I think is cool is that Dr. Zúñiga and his colleagues have sort of come up with something, a theory that wasn't there before, to explain what is the effect of social media use and especially multi-platform social media use on citizens' democratic participation, and then testing that empirically, both in the US and across the world as well. So just to plug the two studies we're going to dive into in this episode, the first is called News Finds Me Perception and Democracy, Effects on Political Knowledge, Political Interest, and Voting. That is in the Journal of New Media and Society. And the second that we're going to look at is Multi-Platform News Use and Political Participation Across Age Groups Toward a Valid Metric of Platform Diversity and Its Effects. And that one is in Journalism and Mass Communication Quarterly. Both links to those studies will be in the show notes. And we're also going to talk about some research that isn't out yet, so giving you a little taste of what's going on with News Finds Me around the globe. So without further ado, let me cut to the interview. My guest is Dr. Homero Zúñiga, professor at the Department of Communication at the University of Vienna. Dr. Zúñiga, thanks for taking the time out and welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you for having me.
So we're going to dig into all things News Finds Me throughout this episode, but I want to start at the very beginning of how you had this idea. And I remember from one of your talks, you told us a story about how this whole idea came about. So do you mind recounting that story for us?
No, not at all. It was back in, well, it's over a decade ago, if you think about it. I was teaching a class at the University of Texas at Austin. And one of the things that I used to do back there when I was teaching these journalism classes was to keep students interested in journalism and keeping up with the news. So I would force them to read the news and watch the news and then come to class prepared to discuss what were the news of the day. And I remember one day asking, what are the news of the day? And one guy raised his hand and he posed what it was important news to him, something about Obama running for president or something that was meaningful. So I asked him, where did you read this? And he couldn't recall, or he had no recollection about where he learned about it. Did you watch it on TV? No. So all of a sudden he told me, well, the news are here. News are around, and because of social media. So I started to think about that in a more meaningful way and discussing with other colleagues. Most of them, my students or former students, now established full professors or associate professors elsewhere, like Sebastian Valenzuela or Seth Lewis and others. And we started to discuss, what is this thing? People have this perception that the news are around and it will get to them somehow. And I remember that, I think it was Seth Lewis, one of them, say like, so news find them. The news just find them because of social media. And that's how ultimately we came up with this idea. And I started to be obsessed with the measurement, how to establish a good operationalization of a concept, both theoretically and empirically. And that's how it started everything. Then after many years of data collection and testings and pilot tests and improving the measurement, we came up with a good measurement of the news finds me perception and some of the effects that we've been able to publish.
Yeah, and I want to dig into those effects throughout the episode, but more theoretically, what is News Finds Me all about and why is it important to study?
So news finds me perception, it is something that has taken place because of our fragmented media environment that we currently have today. These years, we do have information all over the place. Some scholars have referred to this as ambient journalism. They talk about fragmentation of the media. We talk about how social media is always there. Information is constantly present in our lives. So we started to think about the notion that maybe people don't have to be completely active when seeking the news. But that's just a part of the story, because it's not only having a perception that if you don't do anything to pursue news and to be surveillant and to seek news, you will be informed and the news will get you. So it's not only that, it's the part that you actually think that you're well informed by doing that. So the reason as for why you don't pursue the news is not because you're not interested in news or something similar. It's not because you don't have a need of orientation if you follow up the agenda setting paradigm, but rather is a necessity that is not present any longer because you can be well informed by not following the news. And that's one of the three dimensions of the construct. The idea that you have the perception that you will be well informed about current events, despite not purposefully following the news. The second dimension of it is obviously you don't need to seek any news because the news will find you anyways. And the reason that happens speaks to the third dimension, which is your reliance on your network. Due to social media and other information and communication technologies, people may feel that reliance or being reliant on their networks, they will post information and keep them informed about important issues and public affairs. So when you put all these things together, the fact that you can be well informed, despite you're not purposefully pursuing news, the fact that you rely a lot on your networks to keep you informed, and the fact that you consider that there's no need to actually be active in seeking news because the news will find you anyway, those are the three dimensions, the three components that once you measure it empirically will come to conform the news finds me perception.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting because, hearing you talk about social networks, that to an extent, I mean, this might have happened before when you're talking to someone that would relay important news to you. So I want to ask particularly about the social media aspect. How do you think that factors into the news finds me perception?
Actually, social media is key. It's a key element as to work both ways. In the first place, it's a key element to become the precursor of the perception. The more people are using social media, the more they will tend to develop the perception that the news finds them. But one of the first things that we found in the first publication at the Journal of Computer Media Communication was to test that theory that because of the proliferation of the perception, when someone develops the perception that the news find them, they will not be active in seeking news. But when we say that, we are only talking about newspapers, radio, or television. Because what we were confident is that the only media outlet or the media platform that they will continue to pursue to consume news will be social media. And it makes perfect sense. It's just like a perfect circle, right? I use social media. Social media makes me develop the perception that I don't have to be active seeking news through television or newspapers because social media will provide me with the info. So what I'll do next is I will rely on social media, go back on social media and just learn about my news of the day or important news on public affairs in social media. So those were the hypotheses that we wanted to test in relation to media consumption. And in fact, that's exactly what we found, that those who develop the perception will in time use less TV to consume information actively. They will also read less newspapers in time to consume information. However, they will consume more news in social media. Of course, I'm well informed and I rely on my networks in social media. Why do I have to watch TV and read newspapers? I'll just rely on social media and they will keep feeding me info. And that's exactly how it worked.
Yeah, and there's a really interesting passage. I don't have it in front of me right now, but from the latest New Media and Society piece, where you talk about the implications of the kind of curated newsfeed, which is people might feel that they're informed by going to social media, but because they may have self-selected some of the news they're getting, because it blends with entertainment, for example, and different genres of news, that even though they might feel well informed, it's not exactly the top news that's relevant to them, right?
Exactly. And that is tricky. I think there's one of the things that we need to parse out much better. Some of the effects in social media are not very clear cut. That's why precisely some of our colleagues are finding that social media is a positive precursor of knowledge and people will end up learning about politics. Some other found negative effects about knowledge. Some other people found null effects. Hey, social media doesn't do much. You don't learn, but it's not negatively related to learning, to political learning. What we found is that the more people develop the perception, in time, they will learn less politics. So yes, they are somehow exposed to information. However, that information doesn't seem to be correlating with the classic 3 dimensions of political knowledge, like knowledge about institutions and current events. So then it might be the case that they're learning some politics, something that we measure differently, maybe. Infotainment, something like that, perhaps. But what is true that if we abide to the more traditional ways of measuring whether people are knowledgeable about politics, there is a clear negative path from news finds me perception to increasing people's political knowledge in time. So the more they develop the perception in time, they will be less knowledgeable.
So there's this ambient news all around us. People are being exposed to more news probably than, in the history of time, but that might not necessarily be political news or news that's important.
That's exactly correct. So we are in an ambience of permanent exposure to info, but ultimately that info does not transpire onto important political or public affair information that will translate into pragmatic knowledge that is useful for political institutions, for how democracy runs, for what are the political programs, what are the things that an informed public opinion should be aware of to be an active participant of society and democracy. It's exactly what's happening. That's the paradox. We are immersed in an era of overflow of information, constant information surrounding us. However, it does not translate or transpire onto being more knowledgeable, at least for those who develop this perception. In time, they start being less active in seeking regular means of active consumption of news. In the end, it pays off negatively in terms of being less knowledgeable.
Yeah, and I want to dig into some of the specifics of those studies, but I want to ask you, because we have some non-academic listeners tuning in, and also I think we have some students who would be interested in this. I'm personally interested in this. So you had this idea over a decade ago. What's your approach to testing or proving this theory? Because you've recently won some big awards and it seems like the theory that you've developed is actually what's happening in the world. So once you had this idea, what was your mind frame or how did you approach actually operationalizing it?
Right. Well, thanks for your kind words. I don't know if the theory is as important as you make it, but only time will dictate. I hope it's an useful and informative theory for other academics, for sure. In all honesty, most of my research has dealt with notions that explain positive aspects of democracy and technology. Some of our original or seminal work tested the idea that when people are consuming information in social media, they become more participatory. And this has been tested by a number of other colleagues in different countries with different data sets and in different conditions, either through survey or experiments. So it is, once again, one of those paradoxes that we found, that social media and the internet seems to be a very nice way of mobilizing people. But that doesn't mean there might be a knowledgeable mobilization, if you think about it. So in the first place, when I thought about this, honestly, as I said, it was totally the opposite what I was thinking was going to happen. My idea was to test the notion that actually people can be knowledgeable about politics without actively engaging in seeking news. And that will change dramatically what we know about deliberative democratic theory, that people have to be attentive and fulfill their need of orientation and learn about politics and their surroundings. And that way they are part of this informed public opinion and they participate of democracy. All of a sudden, we were just going to go against decades of research, both in political science and communication. Because guess what? You didn't need this dutiful citizen, a la Lance Bennett, someone who needs to keep up and be informed. Actually, due to ICTs and social media in particular, you will have just people learning what they need to learn about social life and politics and public affairs and be knowledgeable. That's what I thought, because remember, this kid came to class knowing about stuff. So I thought in the first place, this is going to disrupt what we know and it's going to change things. The theory is going to be great and very influential theory, but in a positive manner. It turns out to be that I think is a very interesting theory, but perhaps not as a positive light as I thought it was going to be, but rather having another prospect.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And I wanted to ask you about why you chose to use surveys to get at the effects of News Finds Me.
A very interesting question. I think that would be part of pursuing further ways of learning about the real effects of the News Finds Me perception. Most of my research, I need to clarify, is based on survey research to begin with. But I clearly see that this could be something that has potential in an experimental setting too. But first of all, I wanted to make sure that there was something measurable, that it was something pragmatic that can be tested and see if it had effects. Now, learning what I've learned from past studies and the new data collection that we did in over 10 countries, and seeing how the News Finds Me is pervasive and expanding at different contexts in different cultures or different societies, I think we should be also open to other ways of testing this. I recently learned of a project that I positively evaluated for a research team to get a grant to learn more about the News Finds Me perception via experiments. So I wish them the best and I hope they get the funding. And there's something that we should not discard. I think science comes from all different grounds and angles, and experimental conditions should also provide good light and set a good light of the News Finds Me perception.
Yeah, and I ask because I think you're probably the master of measuring mediating effects. And I have a follow-up question to this, but I wanted to ask if you could explain to our listeners what a mediating effect is and why that's important for News Finds Me.
Sure. I don't know if I'm a master of mediating effects, but it's true that mediating effects are becoming more important in our discipline. I think in due credit here, we have a lot to thank Professor Andrew Hayes in Ohio. He has facilitated through a number of packages to statistically assess mediating mechanisms much easier. And he's also a good proponent of mediating effects and mechanisms, to the extent that he has claimed a couple of times to be that if you don't find a variable that mediates a prediction or an effect, it's because you need to think more theory and find another variable that will mediate the process. And basically, going back to your initial part of the question, a mediating mechanism is when a variable A relates to a variable C, but rather than doing it directly, it does it through a mediating variable that we call variable B, for instance. So let's say that we're thinking that when people consume news, they may participate more in politics. That will be a direct effect. You consume more news, you participate more in politics. However, that effect may be mediated by political discussion, for instance. So rather than having a direct effect that goes from news to political participation, what happens is that people consume information, they get exposed to facts.
Right.
And then they use that information to discuss with other people and reassess the information that they have, put it in perspective about things that are important to them, to the community, to the people they know, and then gathering those thoughts that they discuss. And that will in turn predict that they get mobilized and they participate in politics. What I just described is the classic Jabb-McLeod communication mediation model that also Devanza expanded with the citizen communication model. So as you see, more so in our discipline in communication, we are presenting more complex models that are based on these mediating mechanisms, and they move away from other simplistic direct effects of variable X predicting variable Y, but rather having intervening mediating mechanisms in the process.
Right. And the reason I ask is because I was just reading your New Media and Society piece last night, and some listeners might take away from this episode that, oh, news finds me decreases voting. But that's not actually the case, right? There's not a relationship between news finds me and voting, but there's a negative relationship between news finds me and political knowledge, which in turn decreases voting. Do I have that right?
You get that perfect right. It's one of the very interesting findings of mediating mechanisms. Usually a mediating mechanism is described as the first example that I proposed. So you have a positive relationship between news and discussion, and then a positive relationship between discussion and participation. So news through discussion will also positively predict participation. But the kind of mediating mechanism that we were proposing in the New Media and Society piece, I think is very creative, theoretically speaking, because we didn't have a very clear notion. That's why we proposed a research hypothesis about the direct effect of a news transmission perception affecting people when it comes to casting their vote. In fact, we had a strong theoretical argument either way as for whether having this perception will make you more likely to vote or not. We tested that, and as you discussed, there's no direct effect. There's no effect whatsoever going from news finds me perception on voting, at least with this US data. But what we tested, it was something that I think I particularly consider being creative, theoretically speaking, because we knew based on prior research, scores of research have indicated and tested empirically that when people have more interest in politics, that will translate into being more participatory and voting. The same with knowledge. When citizens are knowledgeable about politics, they are informed about what to do and to whom to vote, for instance, and then they end up voting in larger proportions. So that is more political interest, more knowledge about politics translates in higher voting, positive effects. However, we thought that the news transmission perception in time will decrease your knowledge, as we already tested in the other paper, but will also decrease your political interest. Because you know what? The news finds me. Why would I continue to be so interested in politics if things get sipped my way? So what we were thinking is, on the one hand, these mediating variables, political interest and political knowledge, should have a positive effect on voting. However, the news transmission perception should be negatively related to these variables, and the mediating mechanism should also be negative. And that's what I find fascinating. So that is, let's sum up. The news finds me perception will negatively predict political interest in time, will negatively predict political knowledge in time. These two mediating variables should positively predict voting. However, the mediating path going from the news finds me perception through interest and through knowledge on voting should also be negative. And that is exactly what we tested and exactly what happens. Having higher political interest makes you more likely to vote. Being more knowledgeable about politics also makes you more likely to vote. And having a higher perception than the news finds you is not directly related to voting. However, through a negative effect in political interest and lower levels of knowledge, that mediating path, it's also negative on voting. So that's why developing the perception that the news finds you may have deleterious effect in time when it comes to voting in local and national elections. And it's because of their negative relationship, mediating effect through interest and knowledge.
And that is how it's done. I love it. Now, this paper was focused particularly on the U.S.
That is correct.
But you've also done some comparative work in other countries. And is that same process being replicated?
Yeah. So we have collected the data, and the papers, or in this case, two papers that are being developed at this time with different data sets, are not yet published. Both of them are either way under revision and resubmission or in the means of being revised. And they're based on different data sets. One is based on Austrian data. We collected Austrian national representative data through a grant that a colleague of mine received here in Vienna. And that paper relates to the notion of news transmission perception and cynicism, political cynicism. And it also improves the measurement of the news transmission perception. So I'm very excited with that paper. And the other one that you might be referring to, I recently presented at ASCOR. That paper is not being published yet. As I said, is in the midst of being submitted for revision. And we gathered data about the news transmission in different societies. And one of the interesting findings that we got with that data when we compare the United States and how the news finds me perception has developed in the United States, we learned that about 35, almost 36% of the population are somewhat developing the news finds me perception in the United States. And the papers that we publish about the news finds me perception are based on data on the United States, which only about 36% of the people are developing the perception. So when we compare the percentage or the proportion of the people who are developing the perceptions elsewhere, it is astonishing. There are countries in which the news finds me perception is very well established. Like in Spain, for instance, almost 85% of the population have, to some extent, developed the news finds me perception. 72% in Ukraine, 59% in Italy, 50% in Germany, also 50% in Korea, or 40% in New Zealand. So as you can see, in the United States, not many people have developed the perception yet, or at least only about a little bit over 1/3 of the population, 36%. However, we have influential effects already given the smaller proportion. So we're thinking now that we learn more about the data and the effects, we're also expecting that there will be strong effects in other countries as the perception is even more developed.
And why do you think that is? Why do you think it's so high in Spain and Ukraine, for example, and so low in the US, or relatively low?
That's where the money is. It is new to us. We're developing these theories as we speak, literally. So it might be part of the idiosyncrasy of the networks, how Spain may be very overly reliant on networks when it comes to information. It might be the relationship with media systems. If we think about Helen's work and colleagues, maybe it is that we have different media systems, and in those systems where you have media that is a little bit more contentious, maybe people rely more on social media and people that align with their views. We do not exactly know what it is, but what is clear is that the perception is more developed in other parts of the world than in the US.
I'm curious, and without getting, I don't mean to get political here, but one of the reasons I ask is because I'm thinking about this sort of phenomenon of Trump tweets and Trump dominating the news cycle, where on the one hand, there seems to be a sort of convergence of reporting about what's happening at the White House in the US. But on the other hand, people are so inundated with that news all the time that maybe the certain particularities of news aren't shining through anymore. So I'm just wondering, do you think that, when a certain controversial figure dominates the news reporting, and we see this in parts of Europe as well, do you think that might somehow interact with the news finds me perception? Maybe it goes up because people think that if something's important, Trump will tweet about it, and then the media will report about it, and if it's funny, I'll hear it.
I think you're proposing a very interesting piece of research that definitely needs to be done. When we collected the data, it was pre-era of the completely expanded populism movements that we are observing today. The latest data collection that we have in these multiple countries data is 2016. So clearly we need to collect new data. And this semester I'm going to collect new data and we'll be able to test these notions. I think they will have an effect. Maybe not so much as for how people are thinking that the news finds them. Maybe the proportions are similar. The perception continues to steadily develop because if they rely on social media for the news, it will eventually happen. But it might have an effect on what is considered to be facts and what is considered to be knowledgeable today, because we are embarking an era that more so than ever, social media may be also carrying misinformation. And the news as they were presented in 2014, although they would also carry misleading information, and I don't want to say fake news, but fake news, I can see clearly that today it's going to be even a more important issue. So definitely the new data set that we are about to collect this semester in the US should be able to shed more light on those issues. I can wait to get a hold on that. And we will definitely try to cover and measure somehow all these notions of misperceptions, misinformation, and fake news if we can. Although I'd see that maybe an experiment would be better to learn about this. But somehow we need to be able to capture this through survey as well. Because I think you're right. I think the idiosyncrasy of news exposure in social media has changed in these 2 years for sure, particularly in the US and maybe in other countries as well.
Yeah, there's probably something there. I want to ask a few more questions before I let you go. Turning to this journalism and mass communication quarterly piece, which is you're looking at, and I think this is a very interesting argument that I think needs to be more studied, is that multi-platform news use may have some unique effects compared to how scholars traditionally measure online news consumption. So again, it's getting to this idea that there's changing patterns in our media system that are kind of rapidly occurring. So I wanted to ask you, why might multi-platform news use, so getting news from different social media platforms, we talked about that idea of ambient news, why might that have unique effects compared to some traditional understandings of news consumption?
Right. That's very interesting. And what we're thinking with that piece, that one of my former students, now a professor on his own, Trevor Deal, led that piece. We built on previous work that I developed with Ingrid Bachmann. She was my student back in Texas. Now she's a professor at Universidad Católica de Chile. And we had this idea that it's not only the exposure to news in different platforms, but also there might be a preference for platforms and how that matters. And based on that line of research, we came up with several different things that we developed. There's another piece that we published with my former students, now also professors, Jiwon and Monica Chathab, a professor in Arizona. We developed this idea of the media efficacy, and it all talks about the same notion. It is not only how we get exposed to news, but how our preference also matter as for how we understand the news and as for how much the news may have an effect on the information we retain, on how we process the information, on how we learn ideas, so on and so forth. So it might not be anymore the idea of how frequently did you get exposed to news or how much attention did you pay to news, but rather a calculation of this multi-platform, summing different distances of scores within platforms, with each platforms, television, newspaper, radio, online, and social media, all of them expressed in a unique equation that will indicate the total distances within platforms. And that is exactly what we present in that journalism and mass communication quarterly piece. And that's exactly what we see, that there's somehow an association of how diverse a platform may be, given also different age groups, millennials, Generation X, boomers, and beautiful generation. And you see that they will have different dispersion when it comes to the uniqueness of platform preference. I think it's an incipient, valuable work, and I hope it also spurs some curiosity to other scholars, and they continue to gather information as for how news affect people, not only based on sheer exposure to information, but rather all these platforms, preferences, exposure simultaneously, because that's exactly what happens. How can we measure these days how many hours of TV news or time you spend or TV or newspaper or social media? We're doing all these things back and forth simultaneously, second screening. I watch news on television, but at the same time I'm tweeting. It is very hard. So maybe we can get at the influence of all these different platforms and information measuring in these novel ways.
And I'm curious to get your take. I mean, and this is how I'm putting a kind of metaphor on that. It's not like whether you're getting news from Facebook or Instagram versus WhatsApp, but it's kind of like a band or a group of singers that when they sing together, there's a harmony that comes out. And I think that's the idea. It's that it's not just what's the effect of getting news from different platforms individually.
Right, exactly.
It's the composite effect of getting news from just a splintered amount of sources.
Exactly. So it will speak to the heart of how diverse is your basket of information. So it is not so much about, if we translate into analogy of food, it's not so much about how much meat you eat or how much broccoli you eat, but rather how the variety of all these things all together may have an effect, a compound effect. And what we're learning is, like, particularly millennials, they're more likely to depend on multiple media platforms. So for them, news use is directly related to differences in how citizens engage in politics. So for instance, we'll see that once news is related to various modes of political participation, The multi-platform news is positively related to online and offline group participation or political consumerism or even protests. In contrast, if you think about it, multi-platform news is negatively related to voting habits. So you see, once again, there are not so clear-cut behaviors here. Once again, like it happens with social media, certain behaviors within social media may help you get mobilized, but make you learn less about politics. This is something similar. Some of these different multi-platform effects are positive for certain things, but are negative for some others. And that's a constant reoccurring effect with social media. That's why I think, particularly for us, social scientists and political communication scholars, it is very hard because we're facing a not so clear cut anymore models of exposure effects, behavior, this, that. It's not so clear. The exact same media may have different effects, and some of these effects are hydraulic. They do not go towards the same direction sometimes. It's becoming much more complex.
Mm. So in order to tackle this complexity, my last question for you is, what's next? What are you working on in sort of the short to near term?
Wow, we're working on lots of different things. We're working on the area of expanding the news finds media perception paradigm and thinking more about both theoretically and empirically what it means for society. We're also working on the new, as I exposed earlier, on the news data collection that we want to do in the US this semester. And with that one, we want to learn a little bit more about the new idiosyncrasy of news and social media, particularly in times of populism. We're also working on some projects that deal with virtual reality, and we're starting to dig into that area of understanding much more how information that people may get exposed within virtual or enhanced paradigms or environments may help them comprehend better information. So meaning, is it the same when you get exposed to a TV news video clip versus being part of an augmented reality video clip in which you can learn much more depending on how you turn your head or you interact with people in the parliament, for instance. So we want to learn about all these things as well. These are the kind of things that we're currently developing.
Super interesting. Well, I wish you the best of luck with that research. And Dr. Gilda Zúñiga, thanks so much for coming on the Social Media and Politics podcast.
Thank you, Dr. Buceta. Thank you, Mike, for having me. It's my pleasure.
I've just been speaking with Dr. Homero Gilda Zúñiga, professor in the Department of Communication at the University of Vienna and director of the Media Innovation Lab. And that's a wrap for this episode of the Social Media and Politics podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you're just stumbling on the series, make sure that you're subscribed so the episodes will simply find you. Our next episode will be with Katarina Kirk from the Ukrainian organization Stop Fake. We're going to be talking about Russian disinformation ahead of the Ukrainian presidential elections in March. But until then, I'm your host, Michael Buceta, signing off from Copenhagen. See you next time.